Okay, I just made a decision. We're going to go a little bit. I had two pathways I could take after the break, and I've decided on my path based on your questions. A lot of your questions have to do with intimacy with God, mysticism, so other aspects of how do I get close to God. I don't know if I'm going to choose the right path or wrong here. One path was actually about mysticism specifically. The other path was more about how do we love God with our heart, soul, and mind. How about we take a vote? How many of you would rather talk about intimacy and mysticism? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2. Okay, let me tell you both. So we'll call this the side of spiritual intimacy and mysticism. This side, how do we love God with our heart, soul, and mind? They do, but they're very different messages, things I want to address. So, how many of you would like to talk about mysticism and intimacy? How many of you would like to talk about loving God with our heart, mind, and soul? Oh my gosh, it's a split. All right.
I did no good.
Then let me do something that you... Talking about loving God with your heart, mind, and soul is something you can actually do in a lot of different ways, but there's probably not a lot of people in our fellowship that have done the work to study mysticism that can talk more about that. How about if I talk about mysticism? Sure. Yeah. That was a little bit harder for us to dig into. Okay, so let me explain. Let's talk about this, and we're going to do a little Bible study on this one that I think will help us. So when we talk about our relationship with God, what we're talking about is how we relate to God.
Yeah.
The difficulty with relationship with God is it's got complexities that human relationships don't have. But it also has a lot of specific extras that are wonderful, right? So we can't see God, which makes it hard because you don't get direct feedback on your relationship dynamic. But we have constants, like the scriptures. So we can go back and always know, what did God have to say about that? We have that. So that's helpful. And certainly scripture is an integral part of our relationship with God. We worship, which is an integral part of our relationship with God. I do want to clarify, worship is not singing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Worship is anything you do to prostrate yourself in God's presence in a sense of relationship.
Yeah.
Whether it's sitting in silence, that's worship. When preaching, worship. All of it's worship when you're engaged with the divine and your heart is submitted to Him. That's worship.
Yeah.
Okay? Obviously, we understand the prayer component, understanding grace. A very undeveloped aspect, I think, of our theology is how much grace we constantly receive all the time.
Yeah.
And how important that is, which is, if you think of grace as gift, receiving something you don't deserve. Okay? I mean, the fact that we're sitting here breathing right now is grace.
Yes.
The fact that you probably had a meal today is grace.
Right.
Right? So grace is constant. God's grace is, that study is wonderful in and of itself. Sacrament is another way we connect with God. You think, well, we don't practice sacraments. Yes, we do practice sacraments. Sacrament is an event where you are placing yourself in with God in a sense of direct presence that you recognize. So when we take communion, that's very sacramental. We're bowing before the divine. We are contemplating the body and blood of Jesus Christ. We are in His presence as we do so because we believe He's all around us all the time, right? There's a specific event that takes place that is sacramental, right? So that's important. Baptism for us is very sacramental.
Yeah.
Right? Very important part of our culture. Nature, for many, and I think it should be, an increasing awareness, is such an integral part of our relationship with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Being in, for me, as I become more and more aware of God and nature, you step outside, and this is part of living on this amazing planet. I can walk out my front door, and there's just life, right? From the blades of grass to the bugs that I'm swatting on my neck to the lizard that's sitting there eating mosquitoes on my, sorry, Dolly.
Oh, I hate
Lizards
them.
who sit up there. She hates
So
those.
gross.
To the trees, to the fact that you hear the wind move and you hear the birds. I mean, sometimes you just stand outside and close your eyes and hear life.
Yeah.
It's just God everywhere. God is... So there's a difference between, now, does anyone know what pantheism versus panentheism?
No.
Pantheism is the idea that God is everything. Don't step on a bug because you're stepping on God, which I don't think that that's typically where we land, right? But panentheism means that God is in everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So the bug isn't God, but God made the bug.
Right.
Yes.
And we're aware of God that He made the bug. We're aware of it. So sometimes just growing in our awareness is really important for our spirituality.
Yeah.
So that's all part of relationship with God. But then we have this dimension that I briefly explained, which is this mystical dimension.
Yeah.
The intangible, the intimate. So this may surprise some of us, but the most famous book in the Bible is for mystics to study? What do you think? What do you think the most popular book in the Bible is for mystics?
Psalms.
No, not Psalms.
Ecclesiastes.
Not Daniel. What is it? Not Revelation. Song of Songs. So what's funny, I had an interesting conversation with a brother at the break who was explaining the difference between us and, let's say, Catholics. When you walk into a Catholic church, one of the things that the experience creates, the moment you walk in the door, is reverence.
Yes.
You step in the door, and the entire building is designed to help you bow your heart, to think about the divine presence. Whether it's the windows, or it's the artwork, or it's the way that the building leads you toward the cross, or leads you towards where the Eucharist, in their case, is kept in a tabernacle, understanding that this is a holy place. Right? Now, we don't do that.
Right.
There's pluses and negatives to
Right.
that. So our tendency, because we're about relationships and people, and I mean, the song leader takes them 3 songs to get our attention sometimes.
Yes.
And we go, wow, isn't that great? We just love each other. But what does that lean towards? And irreverence leads towards secular humanism, where we depend more on our behaviors, our will, and so you can even sometimes hear it in how we talk to one another. How you build a great family life isn't often praying and teaching your children how to be godly and with Scripture. It's, well, you have to have a family devotional, and you need to have family times, and those things are wonderful, and we need them. But do we tend towards the secular humanistic side, the self-help side? Or do we really have an understanding of our relationship with the divine in a way that we know everything depends on Him? Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have to appreciate and respect that there are things that in other traditions that we need to look at and embrace to make us more whole spiritually. Okay, so when we talk about the mystical, I had a really neat opportunity. Right now, the foremost living expert on mysticism, his name is Bernard McGinn. He's 81 years old, and he teaches at the University of Chicago. And our school brought him in to do a course for us. And he has tracked and written the Encyclopedia of Mysticism. It's now about this many books. And he's only in the 16th century, and he's continuing to write. But his definition of mysticism is, to me, the best thing I've read as a simple definition, and it is this. The mystical element in Christianity is that part of its belief and practices that concerns the preparation for, the consciousness of, and the reaction to what can be described as the immediate or direct presence of God. So in other words, it is your orientation to the divine. It's preparing yourself, coming in contact with, being conscious of, and allowing yourself to be in God's direct presence. Now, you can enter into that state, that place, right here, right now. And Brother Lawrence, anybody read Practicing the Presence of God? Brother Lawrence, 17th century French monk, would say, you can do that and should do that all the time, everywhere. When you're doing the dishes, practice God's presence.
Right.
When you're fixing your shoes, practice God's presence. When you're sitting in church, practice God's presence. And you're in traffic, practice God's presence. Right? That there should be a habit that is formed of your awareness of that mystical element all the time. Okay? So, now, what inevitably happens, especially in our fellowship, is the moment you start introducing something like mysticism, You have those that say, wait a minute, this could go too far.
Yes.
It's a slippery slope. I did a presentation for the church, the Midwest teachers on this concept, and there was an evangelist. First question goes, wow, Dave, this is great. Now, should we be concerned that people are going to get caught up in these ecstatic experiences with God and take them away from their practical Christianity? I said, well, first of all, I don't think that's a problem for our people. That's not where we're at, right? Getting caught up in these ecstatic spiritual experiences and forgetting the rest of the world. We've got a long way to go to even get close to that. But second, there's a real measure of what is true mysticism. True mysticism is not about you just being intimate with God and being able to tell everybody. You know, in the Bible, we do have an author that said they were caught up in the third heaven.
Yeah.
You ever wonder what that is?
Yes.
It's Paul describing this intimate experience he had with God that took him, it was otherworldly, right? He doesn't get into it because it's important to have that intimacy with God, but ultimately it has to lead to loving other people. The real test of intimacy with God is not just that you're intimate with God, it's that it makes you a better Christian.
Yes.
It's that it helps you to help others be more intimate with God. And so when we read the great Christian mystics, part of what's fun about reading them is to see the impact that their lives were having because of this intimacy that they were building and learning and understanding about God. Now, one of our own founders, so we're part of the Stone Campbell movement. That's where we come from, 19th century. Barton W. Stone and Thomas and Alexander Campbell, father and son. This is how Thomas Campbell, one of our founders in 1844, would explain what I'm calling mysticism. What can be more blissful than the exercises of heaven, the contemplation, admiration, adoration, and worship of God? What more desirable than the enjoyment of the divine presence? That's mysticism. Okay? So of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which one would we call the mystical gospel? Which one is more about the intangible? John, right? I mean, John is the mystical gospel. So what I want to do is I want to do a little bit of work in the book of John with you to show you how scriptural this concept is. Let's open our... Do we have Bibles?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to look at John 4, in particular, the woman at the well. But before we can really understand what's going on with the mystical element in John's gospel, we need to understand how John's gospel works. So John's gospel, being a mystical gospel, is a lot about, mostly about, what you don't see. This is a gospel that is drawing you beyond the visible into the intangible, into the transcendent, into the divine, and that's its purpose. Its purpose is don't look at the world through what you see physically. Use your spiritual eyes to look at the world. Wow. That's what's going on in this whole, that's John's agenda in writing this gospel. So we have a lot of things that happen, like this signs and symbols. In John, we don't have any miracles, by the way. We only have signs. Now, other gospel writers would call the same event a miracle. But in John's gospel, he's not concerned that people are impressed with the improbable things Jesus is doing. He's using those events to draw you to a deeper meaning. So, for example, the first sign in John's gospel is the wedding at Cana.
Right.
And Jesus turns water into wine. But it's not about the water into wine.
Right.
It's about something else. It's always about something else in John's gospel. When he feeds the 5,000, it's not about feeding the 5,000.
Right.
It's about something else. So that's why John says these are signs. They're pointing to something else. Another thing that we see in John's gospel is this concept of go and buy, which is the disciples never get it. Jesus is pointing toward the divine, and the disciples keep looking at the literal.
Right.
So what happens is with going by is Jesus says, we need food for these people. And the disciples say, great, let's go and buy food. And Jesus is like, oh, this is not the food, right? The food is spiritual. I am the feeder. I am the living word. I am the living water. And they go and buy because they're always looking for the physical solution to the spiritual problem.
Wow.
Okay, so that's another big element going on in John's gospel. Then this idea of Jesus' humanity is tied up in this same concept. That when Jesus is hungry, is he really hungry? Like, does he need bread? Jesus' hunger is for something spiritual. What quenches Jesus' thirst is not water. It's doing the will of his Father.
Right.
So whenever we see Jesus as a human being in John's Gospel having a human desire, it's almost always connected with a spiritual desire. All right? So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay, and the only other thing I want to tell you before we jump into this is the geographic element of up and down. So where do we see God's presence? We go up to the mountain. Up is God's presence. Down is back into humanity. Right? And we engage in gardens. What happens in gardens? Intimacy. What happens on seas or bodies of water? Usually storms. What happens on mountains? God's presence.
Yeah.
So geographic elements become important as well in the Gospels. Okay, so what's going on in John 4? We have Jesus sitting at a well. That's not just any well. Does anybody remember what well? Jacob's well. Okay, so the moment we see this woman is sitting here at Jacob's well, we draw back to the Old Testament, which is what the readers would have done. And they would have thought, okay, well, what happened to Jacob's well? What typically happens at wells in the Old Testament, besides the flocks give, water?
Marriages. Meet up.
Right. There's some sort of intimate connection. It's usually between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
There's usually romance involved.
Right.
I'm not saying that's what's happening here. I'm just saying that there's an intimate connection that's being made. But when do flocks get watered? Does anybody know? What time of the day do you water the flocks?
Morning.
Actually, when the sun sets. When the sun goes down, you bring the flocks to get watered, and you all wait, and you come together, and then you roll back the stone as a group of shepherds. And so when Jacob comes to the well, and he finds Rachel, it's noon, by the way, when he finds Rachel, and she's sitting there waiting, and all the other shepherds haven't come yet. And so the tradition is that Jacob would wait for the other ones to come, and then they'd all roll back the water. But what does Jacob do to break the culture? He rolls back the stone to feed those sheep right now because he's trying to impress Rachel.
Right.
So it's high noon. He's rolling back the stone. He's watering Rachel's flocks. And he's engaging in an intimate conversation. So that's our background for this story.
Right.
We're going to pick this up in verse 5. Okay. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. What makes Jesus tired? Physical problem with Jesus? Spiritual reality? What happened in John chapter 3 in the story that would have taken life out of Jesus? Who did he engage with that didn't go so well? Nicodemus? Did he get very far with Nicodemus? He didn't. He got stonewalled by Nicodemus. So now Jesus is tired because life did not go out of him. He was not listened to. He's not feeling inspired. So he goes, he's tired, and he sits down by a well and he engages this woman in verse 7. The Samaritan woman came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Okay, knowing what I've just told you, give me a drink really means let me give you spiritual input that will feed me my thirst. Right? That's what he really wants in this. We see that's what happens. His disciples had gone to go and buy. Okay? The Samaritan woman said, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman, And so what is her first reaction to this ask? This is breaking cultural barriers.
Right.
So what we immediately see at this well is this connection with prejudice, this connection with norms. And so what Jesus is going to do, and this is why I'm going to call this whole text is so mystical. Jesus' goal in this whole engagement is to reorient her. To shift the way she sees the world from a literal physical sense to changing it all into a spiritual view of the world. So the first hurdle is a literal view of, wait, you're a man, I'm a woman. You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. And Jesus, does he respond to that? Anybody know? What's he do? He turns her, so the whole goal, he's turning her orientation toward the divine. Jesus answered, if you knew the gift of God and who it was that is saying, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would give you living water. So don't think about the man and woman thing. Don't think about the Jew-Gentile thing. Let's think about the spiritual. Now, to this woman's credit, and this is what's fascinating about her, she gets it. She always understands, and she always moves closer to Jesus' understanding, as opposed to Nicodemus. The woman said, sir, I have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where will you get this living water? And he says, are you greater than our ancestor Jacob? So what is her next objection? If the first one is like the prejudices of the day, what's her next objection? It's this idea that humanistically, you can't get, from a physical standpoint, you can't solve your problem. You have no bucket. You have no bucket, you can't draw water. How are you going to possibly draw out of this well? So she comes again with the physical. Jesus reorients her thinking. Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again of the physical, but those who drink of the water that I give will never be thirsty. Back to the divine. The water I give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life. So Jesus is saying, when you look at your life from the humanistic standpoint, and that's the way you see the world, and you're just trying to get by day to day, meeting your hunger, meeting your thirst, you're always going to go back into that same cycle. When you feed your spiritual life properly, and you reorient yourself to where you should be, then you will find a well of life springing up in you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The intimate, the mystical comes alive. And then the last thing, we don't have time to get into this, I do want to make one point about, Jesus says to her, go and call your husband in verse 16. And she says, well, I have no husband. And he says, you're right in saying that you have no husband. What's happening here? I think we often misunderstand this passage in that we say, well, Jesus is confronting her sin.
Right.
I don't think that's what he's doing in context of what's happening. No. Jesus is confronting her idolatry, not her immorality. Meaning, she's attached herself to the wrong things.
Right.
So when you look at in the Old Testament, whenever immorality is talked about or adultery is talked about, what is it always a metaphor for with the prophets? You've been an adulterous wife. It means that you've been idolatrous. It means that you are worshiping a God that's not our God.
Right.
When you've been adulterous, it means you've attached yourself to something other than God.
Right.
That's always what the prophets were about.
Yeah.
So they confront the adultery because we need to attach ourselves with the proper God of heaven. So Jesus has this interaction with her and he says, yes, you've had these many husbands. In other words, yes, you have all these other attachments. You have all these other idols in your life. And what's her response to Jesus? Look at it if you don't remember. What's her response? Sir, I see that you are, because what do prophets do? Prophets call out your attachments to false idols. Prophets call you back to the divine. Okay? And then she goes on, of course, and I thought about doing a whole sermon on this tomorrow, but we're not going to do that. But And the next section, what's her next objection? It's religion.
Yeah.
Well, we worship on this mountain, and you guys say we have to worship on that mountain. And what do you have to say to that, Jesus? He says, well, the true worshipers aren't going to worship in a physical place. The true worshipers are going to worship in spirit and in truth. And so real worship is different. It's a reorientation to the divine. Okay, so you see why John's gospel is the mystical gospel? Does that make sense? So we're drawing into the divine. Okay, so what I'm going to do in our last few minutes, if I go back to this, the mystical element of Christianity is the beliefs and practices that concern preparation for and putting ourselves into this practice or place of engaging in direct presence. When we think about that, I want to actually skip ahead to a couple suggestions for you. If this is something that you'd like to read about, read mystics, read about people that, one of the things that would classify someone as a mystic, a published mystic, is someone who not only knows themselves how to relate to God in that intimate way, but knows how to teach other people how to do so. Okay? So one of my favorite mystics is someone named Thomas Kelly. There was a book written in 1941 that is called The Testament of Devotion. It's a small book. It's very deep. That really just describes this intimacy with God. I wrote a paper. I'm actually going to England to present a paper on this at a Quaker Scholars Conference. But if you really like this idea of I want to read someone who's gone there and practices that and what it looks like, that's one great starting point. Another more accessible, simple starting point is Brother Lawrence Practicing the Presence of God. Has anybody read that book? Okay. So Brother Lawrence, 17th century French monk who basically worked in the kitchen of the monastery. That's what he did. Then his leg got so bad, he ended up becoming the cobbler fixing the sandals of his brothers in the monastery. And he became famous, not for what he wrote, but for his practice of just living in God's presence all the time. And when people would talk to him, they'd go, how do you do this? You seem so centered and connected. And he'd say, well, here's how I practice the presence of God. And then he would have people writing him letters, and he'd write a letter back. And so really what it is, it's a collection of simple, 1 or 2 page letters that explain how he stays in God's presence. And it's really easy to read, it's very short, but it will challenge you to your core about your intimacy with God. So Thomas Kelly is considered the modern Brother Lawrence of our day. Okay? This is a book that my professor McGinn put together of Christian mystics that kind of samples Christian mysticism throughout the last 2,000 years and different topics. So that's something you can take a look at. The Essential Writings of Christian Mysticism. This is a book that I would encourage for more of the, you've read this book. How many of you read this? Okay, so Cazzaro's great. So this idea of emotional, healthy spirituality is recognizing the reality that our physical world, our spiritual world, our emotional world, our intellectual world, they're all interconnected. And to say that you want to be more spiritual and not deal with your emotional health, you're not going to get very far. And so by dealing with your emotion, if you're jammed up with certain things in your life, or if you somehow had wounds in your life that affect you in the way that you process things emotionally, it's directly connected to your spiritual life. So that's a really great book, if that's something you're interested in. And I already talked to you about practicing the presence of God. So what we're going to do out of respect for the event that's about to take place here is if I can ask for us to go ahead and gather our things, and immediately we'll take our fellowship outside, but I want to really make sure that we show respect here. And tomorrow morning I'm preaching on the book of Jonah. So we will see you tomorrow morning. Thank you. You guys have been an amazing audience. Thank you.